step inside the remarkable life of Robert F. Kennedy, a man propelled by destiny yet haunted by loss. He was the brother of a president, the crusading attorney general who battled Mafia corruption, and the near president whose vision for an empathetic America was tragically cut short. In this cinematic exploration, discover how Bobby Kennedy evolved from a behind-the-scenes political enforcer to the heart of a generation yearning for moral leadership, all while balancing the weight of the Kennedy legacy and the heartbreaks that defined his fate. Robert Francis Kennedy was born on November 20th, 1925, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the seventh child of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. From the beginning, he grew up in a household where unwavering ambition and a sense of near-feudal family loyalty converged. His father, Joseph, was a wealthy businessman and former ambassador to the United Kingdom. His mother, Rose, was the daughter of the influential Honey Fitzgerald, once the mayor of Boston. This lineage gave Bobby, as he was called by his siblings, the sense that public life and public service were not just possibilities, but obligations. Yet for all the bright lights that shone on the Kennedy family, Bobby's earliest years hinted that he was neither the most charismatic nor the most naturally outgoing of the brood. Instead, he was reserved, serious, and habitually overshadowed by his older brother, John Jack, the future 35th President of the United States. Growing up at the family's various estates, most notably Hyannisport on Cape Cod, Bobby experienced a swirl of tennis matches, sailing, formal dinners, Catholic devotions, and intense sibling rivalries. Joseph Sr.'s relentless emphasis on competition meant that all the Kennedy children were expected to excel in academics, sports, and social polish. Bobby, smaller in stature and quieter, often felt lost amid the boisterous chaos, especially compared to Jack or his oldest brother, Joe Jr. But even in these early years, there was a steely determination in him, an iron will lurking beneath a mild exterior. Family friends later recounted how Bobby, though overshadowed, refused to be discounted. If a challenge arose, whether it was a football game on the lawn or a debate at the dinner table, he confronted it with unwavering focus. In 1942, at age 17, Bobby entered Harvard. Shortly thereafter, the rumble of World War II escalated, and young American men everywhere enlisted. By 1943, Bobby had joined the U.S. Navy. Though he served stateside and never saw major combat, the experience broadened his perspective, exposing him to the realities of a nation at war and fueling his understanding of duty. Upon discharge, he returned to Harvard, finishing his undergraduate degree in 1948, then moving on to the University of Virginia School of Law. There, he displayed the same methodical intensity that had marked his Harvard days, studying late into the night, rarely indulging in campus frivolities. He was determined not to be just another playboy scion of a powerful family, but rather someone who earned every credential on his own terms. In 1950, he married Ethel Skakel, a dynamic young woman from a wealthy, devoutly Catholic family. The marriage was filled with a robust energy. Ethel's high-spirited nature balanced Bobby's quieter disposition, and they would ultimately have 11 children together. Their house was forever loud with laughter, arguments, and the chatter of children. Even as his family expanded, Bobby's professional life steered him toward the intersection of law and politics. He briefly served on the staff of Senator Joseph McCarthy's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in the early 1950s. Although he initially worked with McCarthy, who was a friend of the Kennedy patriarch, Bobby soon resigned in disagreement over McCarthy's heavy-handed tactics and reckless accusations. The episode showed that while family loyalty mattered to Bobby, he would not compromise his moral compass to appease someone he felt was harming the country. By 1957, he was chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee, focused on exposing corruption in labor unions. In that position, he developed a reputation for relentless interrogation, particularly in his confrontations with Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa. Critics labeled him ruthless, a word that would dog him for much of his public career. But he seemed to accept, even embrace, the mantle of hard-hitting prosecutor. His demeanor in hearings was calm, almost disarmingly so, yet he'd spearhead inquiries that upended powerful networks of organized crime. It was clear that Bobby believed the law was not a tool to be manipulated, but a shield for the underprivileged and an instrument to curb abuses of power. This single-minded dedication to justice, or to what he perceived as justice, would become a defining trait. Throughout these years, he was also deeply involved in the political rise of his older brother, John F. Kennedy. When Jack decided to run for president in 1960, Bobby took the helm of the campaign operation. Although Jack was the charismatic figure, charming crowds and projecting effortless confidence, Bobby was the force behind the curtain, organizing campaign stops, negotiating with power brokers, orchestrating fundraising, and corralling supporters. Some within the Democratic establishment found him abrasive and wondered if his razor-sharp tactics crossed ethical lines. Yet his dedication was unquestionable. Nobody worked harder. By the time John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in a razor-thin race, those in the know credited Bobby's strategic brilliance as a key factor in the victory. John F. Kennedy became president in January 1961 and quickly appointed Bobby as Attorney General. A storm of criticism followed. Cries of nepotism, of an ethical lapse in placing the president's own brother in such a vital cabinet role. But Bobby deflected these concerns with the same calm severity he'd shown in Senate investigations, proceeding to make waves as the nation's top law enforcement official. One major battlefront was civil rights. Racial segregation in the South stood as a glaring moral and constitutional crisis. Working under President Kennedy, Bobby took on entrenched Southern governors and police officials who defied federal court orders, dispatching U.S. Marshals to protect freedom riders or to enforce integration at universities. Another front was organized crime. As Attorney General, he ramped up prosecutions against the Mafia, using wiretaps, informants, and grand jury investigations to corner powerful mob bosses who had often enjoyed political protection. Under his watch, the Justice Department became a more aggressive force for social change and legal reform, which delighted some Americans and infuriated others. By 1963, the Kennedy administration was grappling with multiple crises, from civil rights tensions at home to Cold War tensions abroad. For Bobby, the most searing event of that year was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November 22nd. The news reached him almost immediately, and the shock and grief that consumed him were unparalleled. He was not only losing a brother, but also the central figure around whom his own public life had revolved. Over the ensuing months, he sank into a profound depression. The White House had been transformed into Lyndon B. Johnson's realm, and Bobby found himself sidelined in an administration run by a man he neither fully trusted nor admired. By mid-1964, he left his post as Attorney General, searching for direction in a world where his brother's bright star had been so cruelly extinguished. In November 1964, he won a seat in the U.S. Senate from New York, a victory that surprised those who dismissed him as a mere political opportunist. In truth, the move to the Senate signaled a crucial shift. Bobby was stepping out of his brother's shadow to carve his own identity. And in the Senate, a transformation began. The once icy, combative figure started to reveal a warmer, more empathetic side. He traveled widely across New York State and beyond, visiting impoverished rural zones, inner city ghettos, and Native American reservations. He listened to people's hardships and frustrations, and in turn, his own speeches took on a tone of urgency and moral sincerity. He spoke of bridging the gap between rich and poor, of confronting the underlying injustices that fueled racial tensions, and of addressing the war in Vietnam not merely as a geopolitical issue but as a human crisis. The war in Vietnam would become a defining issue for Bobby. Early in his brother's presidency, he had gone along with the idea of containing communism in Southeast Asia. But as the war escalated under President Johnson, with mounting casualties and vivid accounts of civilian suffering, Bobby began publicly questioning the conflict's direction. By 1966, he was openly critical of Johnson's strategy, incurring the president's ire. Their already awkward relationship grew hostile. LBJ saw Bobby as harboring a personal vendetta, while Bobby believed LBJ was leading the country down a destructive path. This tension exploded into public view when Bobby delivered speeches that called for a political solution in Vietnam, stressing the moral cost of continuing the war indefinitely. Meanwhile, Bobby's personal life thrived in some respects, surrounded by Ethel and their rapidly expanding family. Yet tragedy still hovered in the background. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was incapacitated by a stroke. Bobby's older sister, Kathleen, had died in a plane crash in 1948. John's assassination still haunted them all. By 1967, news spread of turmoil across the country, riots in cities, deepening unrest over civil rights, anti-war protests on campuses. Bobby recognized that America was at a breaking point, fracturing under the weight of unaddressed racism and an unending foreign war. More and more, he became the one mainstream politician to whom disillusioned citizens pinned their hopes. Early 1968 brought an unthinkable blow. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th in Memphis. That same night, Bobby was scheduled to speak in a black neighborhood of Indianapolis. Advisors warned him not to go. The mood was volatile, and there was no police protection. He insisted, and from the back of a flatbed truck, he broke the news of King's death to a shocked crowd. He spoke from the heart, mentioning his own brother's murder, calling for compassion and unity instead of violence. Miraculously, Indianapolis did not erupt in riots as so many other cities did that night. People later said that Bobby's raw sincerity made all the difference, forging an instant bond in the midst of grief and rage. By then, the calls for him to run for president reached fever pitch. The Democratic establishment was fractured. President Johnson had announced he would not seek re-election. Vice President Humphrey was stepping in, and Eugene McCarthy was mobilizing an anti-war movement. In March 1968, Bobby declared his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. At once, he was vilified by some as an opportunist arriving late in the race, while others hailed him as the only figure capable of bridging the divides in American society, racial, cultural, and generational. His campaign was a spectacle of passion. Thousands thronged to see him at universities, in ghettos, on farms. African Americans, Latino farm workers, and white working-class voters alike rallied behind him, believing that he could chart a new course. Yet the criticism persisted from various angles. Some on the left felt he was not anti-war enough. Some in the establishment found him too radical, while conservatives saw him as dangerously progressive. Nevertheless, he pushed forward. By the night of June 4th, 1968, the stakes were enormous as the California primary took place. A win in California would give Bobby a decisive advantage toward securing the nomination. In the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, The atmosphere that evening was triumphant. He had clinched victory. Overjoyed supporters cheered, chanting his name, confetti raining down. He delivered a short victory speech just after midnight on June 5th, culminating with the words, "Now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there," a reference to the upcoming Democratic National Convention. Then he stepped away from the podium, heading through the kitchen corridor to meet the press. In a moment of tragic repetition echoing his brother's fate, gunshots crackled in that cramped passage. Sirhan, a Palestinian angered by Bobby's stance on Israel, opened fire. Bobby was struck multiple times, falling mortally wounded onto the concrete floor. Ethel, pregnant with their 11th child, was by his side within seconds. The chaos was immediate. Screams, cameras flashing, aides pinning the assassin to a table, news reporters calling for medics. Bobby lay on the floor, bleeding profusely, his eyes wide with shock. A teenage busboy held his head, trying to offer comfort amid the pandemonium. The footage and photographs from that night became etched into the national consciousness, a horrifying replay of Dallas. For about a day, he lingered in critical condition at Good Samaritan Hospital, but his wounds proved fatal. At 1:44 a.m. on June 6, 1968, Robert Francis Kennedy died. The nation reacted with numb disbelief, forced again to confront the shattering presence of political violence. His funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Thousands gathered, weeping openly, refusing to believe that yet another Kennedy with the potential to transform America had been taken by an assassin's bullet. The funeral train that carried his body to Washington, D.C., drew massive crowds lining the railroad tracks. Black, white, rich, poor, urban, rural, many of them still wearing campaign pins for RFK. They cried as the train passed or stood in silent salutes, grieving not only the man, but also the moral vision he embodied. Even more so than after John F. Kennedy's assassination, Robert's death felt like a final blow to the aspirations of the early 1960s. The brief flicker of hope that Bobby's campaign had reignited, hope for an end to Vietnam, an active stand against poverty and racism, a politics driven by empathy, went dark. Analysts have since debated what kind of president he would have been. Would he have withdrawn from Vietnam decisively, perhaps saving thousands of American and Vietnamese lives? Could he have channeled the energy of the civil rights movement in a way that prevented the polarizing 70s and 80s? Nobody can say for certain. But the sense of irretrievable loss lingers, punctuated by the knowledge that at 42, Bobby was cut down at the moment he seemed poised to ascend to the nation's highest office. In the decades following his death, Robert F. Kennedy became an American myth in his own right. Older images of him as a ruthless enforcer were overshadowed by the later chapter, where he championed the poor, sympathized with civil rights struggles, and questioned the moral basis of U.S. foreign policy. Politicians seeking moral credibility still quote his speeches. His statements on bridging racial divides, addressing economic inequality, and achieving peace remain eerily relevant. Students reading history discover how he visited Mississippi Delta communities and walked alongside Native Americans, forging a new style of politics that combined unsentimental pragmatism with a deeply human compassion. Today, Robert F. Kennedy's name evokes both sorrow and admiration. Sorrow for the potential never realized, a presidency that might have recalibrated an America spiraling from Vietnam to Watergate. Admiration for the journey he made, transitioning from a hardened, almost Machiavellian political operative to a champion who spoke of moral redemption, calling on America's better angels. He remains a symbol of how personal tragedy can pivot a man toward greater empathy rather than bitterness, and how politics at its highest calling can address the deep-seated wounds of a divided populace. And so Robert Francis Kennedy, Bobby to those who knew him best, closes out his chapter in history as the man who might have been president, the man who experienced heartbreak after heartbreak, yet still found the will to stand before the country and insist on a path of justice and humanity. His final words on that fateful night, "Now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there," carry a haunting resonance. A man prepared to fight for the soul of America, cut down just before he could truly step into the role fate seemed to be guiding him toward. The memory of him lies not just in the tragedy of his end, but in the quiet moral fire that burned within him, a fire that, for a brief time, illuminated an America yearning for a more compassionate future.